Part 1 absolutely blew up in the comment section. Low views, but huge impact. And honestly, that's all I care about. Getting the truth out there is what matters, not the algorithm. Before we dive in, do me a quick favour. Smash that like button, hit subscribe and turn on all notifications. The YouTube overlords aren't exactly promoting content that challenges mainstream narratives, so that bell's the only way you'll catch part 3. Trust me, it's the finale you do not want to miss. Look, after this series, I promise we'll get back to the more upbeat stuff. But right now, this matters too much to ignore. The best way to support this message is to watch all the way through and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Each minute you watch genuinely means the world to me. Speaking of comments from part 1, check these out. Notice something. Not a single specific counter-argument. Not one piece of evidence refuting what I presented. Just dismissals and vague claims without substance. In our last episode, we exposed the theological contradictions that plague Islam at its core. Today, we're going deeper, straight to the man himself. Muhammad, was he truly God's final prophet, or something entirely different? The evidence I'm about to drop is so compelling that most critics can only respond with, "Bro, go back to school," instead of addressing the actual facts. While I'm building this epic structure in Minecraft today, I'll be demolishing the myths around Muhammad with cold, hard historical facts that Islamic scholars don't want you to know about. Will never be taught in your comparative religion class. Come straight from Islam's own trusted sources. We're covering the Satanic Verses incident that even Muhammad couldn't explain away, the suspicious revelations that conveniently served his personal desires, his troubling moral record, and why he spectacularly fails every biblical test for true prophethood. If you've only heard the sanitized, politically correct version of Islamic history, buckle up. This might get uncomfortable, but if you're someone who values truth over comfort, who'd rather face facts than live in delusion, then stay with me. So grab a snack, settle in, and let's expose the historical evidence that has Muslim apologists attacking the messenger instead of addressing the message. Muhammad's life is shockingly undocumented by historical standards. You'd think that for the final prophet, who supposedly changed the world, we'd have mountains of contemporary evidence, right? Wrong. The earliest biography of Muhammad we have was written by Ibn Ishaq, more than 125 years after Muhammad's death. And guess what? We don't even have Ibn Ishaq's original work. We only have a later, edited version by Ibn Hisham, who openly admits he removed things which it is disgraceful to discuss about Muhammad. Think about that for a moment. That would be like our earliest account of Jesus being written in 160 AD instead of within decades of his life. And unlike Jesus, who was mentioned by non-Christian sources like Josephus and Tacitus within decades of his death, there is virtually no mention of Muhammad in any non-Muslim source during his lifetime, or immediately after. I'm not making this up, folks. The first clear non-Muslim mention of Muhammad appears in a Syriac chronicle from 636 AD, and it merely mentions an anonymous prophet armed with a sword. The archaeological evidence is equally sparse. The earliest inscriptions mentioning Muhammad date from the late 7th century, decades after his death. Even early Islamic coins and inscriptions are strangely silent about Muhammad. The Dome of the Rock inscription from 692 AD mentions him, but that's 60 years after his supposed death. Before that, almost nothing. Now I can already hear Muslim apologists objecting. But what about the Hadith collections? They're rigorously authenticated. Let me address that. The major Hadith collections, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, weren't compiled until the 9th century, over 200 years after Muhammad's death. That's like us only now collecting eyewitness accounts of the American Revolution. The Hadith collectors themselves admit they had to sift through hundreds of thousands of fabricated sayings. Bukhari reportedly examined 600,000 traditions and rejected 592,700 of them as unreliable. That's a 99% rejection rate. When your primary sources acknowledge that 99% of the material circulating about your prophet was fake, that should raise some serious questions. But, Muslims will argue, the Isnad system of chain narration guarantees authenticity. While the Isnad system was impressive for its time, it has critical flaws. For one, it relies entirely on the assumed honesty of each narrator. There's no way to independently verify their claims. Second, the earliest links in these chains are completely unverifiable. And third, hadith with perfect chains can directly contradict each other, leaving scholars to decide which authentic tradition to accept. Even early Muslim scholars recognized these problems. Imam Malik preferred the living tradition of Medina over many hadith, and the Mu'tazilites rejected most hadith about God's attributes. The modern academic consensus is that while the hadith contain historical kernels, they've been heavily shaped by later theological and political concerns. Some Muslim scholars might counter, but the Quran itself is a contemporary source. This is circular reasoning. We can't use the Quran to verify Muhammad's life when the Quran's authenticity depends on Muhammad's prophetic status, the very thing we're trying to verify. Besides, the Quran contains surprisingly little biographical information about Muhammad. I'm not suggesting Muhammad didn't exist. I believe he did. But I am pointing out that the historical blackout surrounding his life should raise serious red flags about the reliability of later Islamic traditions. Consider this. While we have coins, inscriptions, and non-Christian sources mentioning Jesus within decades of his life, the historical Muhammad is shrouded in darkness for over a century. Even Islamic scholar Fred Donner acknowledges that the earliest Muslims may not have seen Muhammad as founding a new religion at all. This understanding emerged later as the empire grew. Now compare this to Jesus. We have 4 independent gospel accounts written within 30 to 70 years of his death. We have Paul's letters, written even earlier, within 20 years. We have Roman historians like Tacitus, Jewish historians like Josephus, and even hostile sources like the Babylonian Talmud confirming Jesus' existence and crucifixion. The historical evidence for Jesus dwarfs that of Muhammad. Some Muslims argue Christianity had centuries to establish its narrative before Islam emerged. But that actually makes Islam's case worse. Muhammad claimed to be restoring the original religion of Jesus and Abraham. Yet his version contradicts sources much closer to their lifetimes. So we're left with biographies compiled centuries later, filled with miraculous tales and contradictions, with enormous incentive to enhance Muhammad's image as the Islamic empire expanded. As any historian will tell you, that's the perfect recipe for legendary development. But that's just the foundation of our investigation. Let's shed some light on what those later biographies actually tell us, including the events Islamic apologists desperately want to hide. Let's examine one of Islam's biggest embarrassments, what scholars call the Satanic Verses incident. This isn't something I'm making up. It's recorded by early, trusted Muslim historians like Al-Tabari, Ibn Sa'd, and even mentioned by Ibn Ishaq. Here's what happened. During a difficult period in Mecca, when Muhammad was facing strong opposition, he was reciting what would become Surah 53 of the Quran. After mentioning 3 pagan goddesses, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, Muhammad suddenly added these words, "These are the exalted cranes, Garanik. Indeed, their intercession is to be hoped for." This was a bombshell moment. Muhammad had just affirmed the power of pagan deities. The Meccans were thrilled. Muhammad had validated their gods. But later, Muhammad retracted these verses, claiming that Satan had cast them onto his tongue. In Tabari's account, Muhammad literally confessed, "I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." Let that sink in. By Muhammad's own admission, Satan influenced his revelation, and he couldn't tell the difference between God's words and Satan's. Now, modern Muslim apologists have 4 main responses to this devastating incident, and all of them fail. First, some claim the incident never happened, arguing it's a fabricated story. But this contradicts their own historical methodology. The incident is reported by multiple early sources with strong chains of narration, the same standards Muslims use to authenticate other aspects of Muhammad's life. Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari, and Ibn Sa'd all record it. If we reject this incident, we'd need to reject much of what Muslims accept about Muhammad's biography. Second, some argue these sources aren't reliable enough. But these are the same historians Muslims rely on for virtually everything they know about Muhammad's life. You can't cherry-pick, accepting these sources when they portray Muhammad positively, but rejecting them when they reveal uncomfortable truths. Third, some Muslims claim the story contradicts the Quran's promise that Allah would protect his revelation. This is circular reasoning. You can't use the Quran to prove the Quran's reliability. The whole question is whether Muhammad was receiving genuine revelation or not. Fourth, some modern apologetic work claims the grammatical structure of the Satanic Verses doesn't match the Quranic style. This is revisionist history. The original sources explicitly state that Muhammad's companions couldn't tell these verses from the rest of the Quran. They were stylistically identical enough to fool even close followers. Let's also address the claim that prophets are protected from major sins. This is a later theological development not supported by the Quran itself. In fact, the Quran repeatedly mentions Muhammad's sins and need for forgiveness. 40:55, 47:19, 48:2. The notion of prophetic infallibility, isma, was developed centuries later to address embarrassing incidents exactly like this one. What's particularly telling is that early Muslim scholars didn't deny this event. They tried to explain it. Al-Tabari, al-Zamakhshari, and others accepted it, happened but offered various theological explanations. Only later, when the theological stakes became clearer, did outright denial become the standard response. According to Deuteronomy 13:1-5, if a prophet ever tells you to follow other gods, even once, that person is a false prophet, period. Muhammad failed this test spectacularly by his own admission. Some Muslims might counter, but all prophets face temptation. Yes, but there's a crucial difference. When Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, Jesus immediately recognized him and rejected all his offers. Muhammad, by contrast, mistook Satan's words for divine revelation and only realized his error later when informed by the real Gabriel. No biblical prophet ever, not Moses, not Isaiah, not Jesus, ever accidentally preached polytheism and then blamed it on satanic influence. Even when facing persecution or death, God's true prophets maintain their message with perfect consistency. The Satanic Verses incident alone should be enough to dismantle Muhammad's prophetic claims. But believe it or not, it gets worse when we look at the revelations that conveniently benefited Muhammad personally. The most suspicious patterns in Islamic history is how often revelations came down exactly when Muhammad needed them for his personal benefit. Let me give you some examples that will make your redstone circuits short out. When Muhammad wanted to marry Zainab, the beautiful wife of his adopted son Zayd, it caused a scandal. Even in the 7th century Arabia, taking your son's wife was taboo. But right on cue, Muhammad received a revelation, Quran 33:37, instructing him to marry her. The verse conveniently explained that adoption isn't really real in Allah's eyes, so it wasn't actually incest. How convenient. Muslim apologists typically defend this by claiming Allah was abolishing the pre-Islamic adoption system to establish blood lineage. But why would the perfect, eternal law of God need to use Muhammad's personal desire for his son's wife as the vehicle for this legal change? Couldn't Allah have revealed this rule without the appearance of self-interest? Muhammad's young wife Aisha was no fool. She remarked sarcastically, "I feel that your Lord hastens to satisfy your desires." That's not my comment. That's from Muhammad's favourite wife, as recorded in Sahih Muslim 1464. Islamic scholars try to downplay this by questioning the authenticity of this hadith, despite it appearing in Sahih Muslim, one of their most trusted collections. This is the definition of special pleading, accepting hadiths that portray Muhammad positively while rejecting those that don't, even when they meet the same authentication standards. Then there's Quran 33:50 to 51, which grants Muhammad, and Muhammad alone, special marital privileges beyond the four-wife limit imposed on other Muslim men. It even gave him the right to sexual access to slave girls and women who offered themselves to him. No other Muslim got this divine exception. Defenders argue these privileges were burdens tied to Muhammad's leadership role. Really, having unlimited wives and concubines is a burden. Besides, if these special rules were about leadership responsibilities, why don't they appear in revelations about governance, justice, or warfare? Why are Muhammad's sexual privileges mixed with his domestic disputes? When Muhammad's wives complained about his relationships with slave girls, particularly Maria the Copt, down came Quran 66:1-5, where Allah scolded his wives for making Muhammad feel bad and threatened them with divorce. Some Muslim scholars claim this incident involved Muhammad abstaining from honey, not a slave girl. But early commentators like Ibn Abbas, al-Tabari, and al-Zamakhshari explicitly mention the slave girl as the cause. The honey explanation appears to be a later fabrication to avoid the problematic implications. When people overstayed their welcome at Muhammad's house, Allah sent down a verse about dinner etiquette, Quran 33:53, telling guests not to linger at the Prophet's house. Seriously, the creator of 100 billion galaxies apparently concerned himself with Muhammad's dinner party problems. But these rules were to protect Muhammad's privacy, some might claim. Strange how God's concern for privacy didn't extend to Muhammad's many wives who had to share cramped quarters. And why would an eternal, divine law include specific rules for entering one man's house, rules that became irrelevant the moment he died? Think about this pattern. When Muhammad was weak in Mecca, Allah's revelations preached peace and tolerance. To you your religion, and to me mine. 109:6. When Muhammad gained military power in Medina, suddenly Allah commanded warfare against unbelievers. Fight those who do not believe in Allah. 9:29. The revelations shifted precisely as Muhammad's political circumstances changed. Muslims argue this was progressive revelation, suitable to each stage of the growing community. But wouldn't an all-knowing God have a consistent message, regardless of political power? How convenient that divine morality aligned perfectly with political expediency. True principles don't change based on whether you have an army. Even the direction of prayer, Qibla, changed in Quran 2:142-144, from Jerusalem to Mecca, conveniently helping distinguish Muslims from Jews after political relations with Jewish tribes deteriorated. The standard response is that this was always God's plan to test the believers. But if Muhammad had been rejected by the Meccans and embraced by the Jews instead, would the Qibla still have changed? The timing suggests political calculation, not divine planning. This pattern of convenient revelations becomes unmistakable when you chart it against Muhammad's rising power. As a rational person, ask yourself, does this look like divine guidance or a man using revelation to justify his desires and political needs? Compare this to Jesus, who received no divine revelations exempting him from moral rules or granting him special privileges. Instead, Jesus taught, "Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant." Mark 10:43. When Satan offered Jesus worldly power, he rejected it, the opposite of Muhammad's trajectory. No biblical prophet ever received revelations that conveniently granted them sexual privileges, political power, or personal exemptions from moral rules. Moses, Jesus, and the prophets lived lives of sacrifice, not special privilege. But as damning as these convenient revelations are, they pale in comparison to Muhammad's moral record as a supposed exemplar for all humanity. Discuss something that makes many modern Muslims deeply uncomfortable: Muhammad's career as a military leader and his moral choices in that role. After Muhammad gained power in Medina, he personally led or commissioned at least 86 military campaigns in the final 10 years of his life. That's a new battle every 6 weeks. And these weren't defensive struggles, most were offensive raids against neighbouring tribes and trading caravans. Islamic apologists often claim these were purely defensive wars, but Islamic sources themselves contradict this narrative. The earliest raids on Meccan caravans occurred during times of peace, not war. Ibn Ishaq explicitly states Muhammad sent Abdullah ibn Jahsh to lie in wait for the Quraysh at Nakhla. This was ambushing travellers for their goods, what we would today call highway robbery. The Battle of Badr, celebrated in Islamic history, began as an attempt to raid a rich caravan. When the Meccans sent forces to protect their goods, Muhammad engaged them instead. The raid's economic motivations are clear in Muhammad's own words, recorded in Sahih Muslim. This is the Quraysh caravan containing their property. Go out to attack it. Perhaps God will give it as a prey. Some defenders argue these raids were justified as reparations for property Muslims left in Mecca. If that's true, why doesn't the Quran frame them this way? And why target random travellers rather than those who actually took their property? These raids eventually created an economic system dependent on conquest, with 1/5 of all spoils going to Muhammad himself. Quran 8:41. This system of wealth redistribution through warfare became a cornerstone of early Islamic expansion. But Muhammad fought according to strict ethical rules. Some Muslims protest, yet the historical record shows otherwise. In Sahih Muslim 4294, Muhammad approved attacking civilians at night, even when told women and children would be casualties. He also employed tactics like cutting down date palms to pressure the Banu Nadir tribe, economic warfare against civilian infrastructure that Islamic law later forbade. The treatment of captives was particularly troubling. After the Battle of Badr, Muhammad reportedly ordered the execution of prisoners like Nadir ibn al-Harith, whose crime was criticising Muhammad's prophetic claims. This contradicts the Quranic guidelines for treating prisoners, 47:4, developed later. But the most disturbing incident was the treatment of the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza. After they surrendered, Muhammad ordered all 600 to 900 men of the tribe to be beheaded in a single day, with their women and children enslaved. This mass execution is documented in multiple Islamic sources, including Ibn Ishaq's biography and the authentic collections of Bukhari and Muslim. Islamic scholars have 3 main defences for this atrocity. First, they claim the Banu Qurayza violated a treaty and committed treason during the Battle of the Trench. But historical details are murky. There's little evidence they actually fought against Muslims, and the main traitor, Ka'b ibn Asad, had been installed as their leader by Muhammad himself after exiling the previous chief. Second, they argue the judgment came from Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, not Muhammad. But Muhammad explicitly approved this judgment, calling it the judgment of Allah from above the 7 heavens. Bukhari. He had full power to grant mercy, but chose not to. Third, they claim this was normal treatment for traitors in warfare. But this ignores Muhammad's supposed role. If he was truly sent as a mercy to all worlds, Quran 21:107, why didn't he rise above the brutal standards of his time? Jesus faced betrayal from his own disciple and responded with mercy, not execution. Muhammad also ordered assassinations of critics, including poets who merely wrote satirical verses against him. Asma bint Marwan, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, and Abu Afaq were all killed on Muhammad's orders simply for verbal opposition or mockery, according to Islamic sources. Muslim scholars sometimes question these assassination accounts, but they appear in early sources with chains of narration that would be accepted for any other historical claim about Muhammad. The celebration of these killings in early Islamic literature suggests they were viewed as righteous, not fabricated to embarrass the Prophet. On the personal front, Muhammad's marriage to Aisha, when she was 6 or 7 years old, consummated when she was 9 according to multiple Sahih hadiths, including Bukhari 5134, raises obvious ethical concerns. This isn't just reported once, but in at least 7 collections considered highly reliable by Muslims. Modern apologists offer several defences. Girls matured faster back then. But physical puberty isn't the same as psychological readiness for marriage and sex. Modern medicine shows brain development continues into the 20s. It was normal for the time. Even if true, shouldn't God's final prophet transcend cultural norms rather than embody the most problematic ones? If Muhammad merely reflected his culture, what makes him different from any other 7th century man? Aisha had a happy marriage. Individual experiences don't justify a practice. Some child brides today may not complain, but we recognise the inherent power imbalance and harm of such relationships. These hadiths are unreliable. This is selective skepticism. These same scholars accept equally authenticated hadiths about prayer, fasting, and other practices. Why reject only those that cause moral discomfort? What about Muhammad's treatment of women? While he did institute some protections for women that were progressive for 7th century Arabia, he also institutionalized practices like polygamy, sex with female slaves, and wife-beating, Quran 434, all of which have caused lasting harm. The infamous verse on wife-beating, 434, has been reinterpreted by progressive Muslims as lightly tap or even separate from them. But classical commentators for centuries understood it as physical discipline. Ibn Kathir, Tabari, Qurtubi, all major authorities, interpreted it as literal beating, with only contextual limitations on severity. Now let me anticipate the objection. You're judging Muhammad by modern standards. But that's precisely the point. If Muhammad was truly God's final prophet and perfect example for all humanity, for all time, as Quran 33:21 claims, his moral example should transcend his era, not be limited by it. Either Muhammad's example is timeless, or it's bound by 7th century limitations. Muslims can't have it both ways. Compare this record with Jesus, who never killed anyone, never ordered executions, consistently protected the vulnerable, elevated women's status, rejected violence even in self-defense, and taught us to love our enemies rather than raid their caravans. The contrast couldn't be more stark. One was a political military leader who killed enemies and critics. The other laid down his life for his enemies and asked God to forgive his executioners. But perhaps the most definitive way to evaluate Muhammad's prophethood is to apply the biblical criteria for identifying true and false prophets. Feared his own revelations might be demonic. After his first encounter in the cave, Islamic sources record that he was terrified he might be possessed by a jinn, demon. He even contemplated suicide by throwing himself off a mountain. His wife Khadijah had to reassure him the experiences were divine. Think about that. True biblical prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or John the Baptist never doubted whether their revelations came from God versus a demon. They knew with certainty. Muslims often cite Deuteronomy 18:18, which promises a prophet like Moses as predicting Muhammad. But let's test this claim. The prophet like Moses would speak with God directly, face to face. Moses did this, but Muhammad received revelation through Gabriel. Perform great public signs. Moses did many, but Muhammad's only claimed miracle was the Quran itself. Lead people out of bondage. Moses did this, but Muhammad created a conquering empire. Be from among the brethren of the Israelites. This refers to other Israelite tribes, not distant Ishmaelites. Muhammad simply doesn't match the criteria. He fails the Deuteronomy 18 test for accuracy. He fails the Deuteronomy 13 test by temporarily endorsing other gods. And he fails to match the prophet like Moses profile. Jesus, on the other hand, passes every biblical test with flying colours. He never spoke falsely. He never directed worship to other gods. He performed undeniable public miracles. He spoke with God face to face. And he was indeed from the Israelites. The biblical verdict is unambiguous. Muhammad fails the scriptural test for prophethood. To finish today's build, we're left with a crossroads representing the choice before anyone examining these facts honestly. We've seen that Muhammad's historical record is problematically distant from the events it describes. we've uncovered the Satanic Verses incident where, by his own admission, he couldn't distinguish between divine revelation and satanic influence. We've noted the suspicious pattern of convenient revelations that served his personal interests. We've confronted his troubling moral record as a military leader. And we've applied the biblical tests that clearly identify him as failing the criteria for prophethood. Some Muslims might object, but you're using Christian standards to judge Islam. To which I respond, if Islam claims to be the continuation and correction of the Judeo-Christian tradition, if it claims Abraham, Moses and Jesus as prophets, then it must be evaluated by the standards those prophets established. You can't claim to fulfill a tradition while simultaneously rejecting its foundational criteria for truth. Others might say Muhammad's military campaigns were necessary for the survival of early Islam, but this argument undermines Islam's claim to divine origin. True divine messages have historically spread despite persecution, not through military dominance. The early Christians faced 3 centuries of brutal persecution, but spread peacefully throughout the Roman Empire. If Islam required the sword to survive, what does that suggest about its divine backing? Some modern Muslim scholars attempt to separate Muhammad's prophetic role from his political military leadership, arguing we should follow his spiritual teachings but not necessarily his warfare tactics. This approach, while understandable, contradicts the Quranic declaration that Muhammad is the perfect example in all aspects of life. 33:21. If parts of his example are now considered morally problematic, the entire claim of his perfect, exemplary status collapses. As a final objection, some point to Muhammad's positive achievements: uniting Arabia, establishing clear monotheism, prohibiting female infanticide, creating a community that preserved knowledge during Europe's dark ages. These contributions are real, but they don't validate prophetic claims. Many non-prophets throughout history have achieved similar social reforms. The question isn't whether Muhammad did some good things, it's whether he was truly God's final messenger. The evidence we've examined strongly suggests he was not. When you step back and look at this evidence objectively, the conclusion is inescapable. Muhammad was not a true prophet of the biblical God. He was at best a sincere but mistaken religious leader. Or at worst, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. In our third and final episode, we'll contrast this with the compelling evidence for Christianity, how Jesus fulfills prophecy, displays a perfect moral character, provides a coherent theological framework, and offers the only satisfying solution to humanity's deepest problem, our separation from God. Some skeptics might wonder, why does this matter? Why not let Muslims believe what they want? It matters because truth matters. If Muhammad isn't Allah's messenger, then 1.8 billion people are following a false prophet. It matters because Islam's growth continues through conversion, and potential converts deserve to know the full historical picture before making such a momentous decision. And it matters because Islam makes exclusive truth claims that directly contradict Christianity's core message. If this video has challenged your thinking, that's good. Truth should challenge us. Remember to hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss our final instalment. Based on how many notifications I've received of this content being flagged, Part 3 might not stay up long, so catch it while you can. For any Muslims watching, I want you to know this isn't about attacking you. It's about honestly examining historical claims. Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." I believe that with all my heart. The truth about Muhammad might be uncomfortable, but facing it is the first step toward finding something far better. A relationship with the God who truly loves you and sent his son to prove it. This is BibleCraft, signing off until next time. Keep building in Minecraft, and more importantly, keep building your faith on the solid foundation of truth, not the shifting sands of false prophecy.